She should have walked past him. That's what everyone else did, that cold morning at the station boots, stepping over his bleeding body voices, muttering that he wasn't their problem. A dying man in the snow ribs, showing through his torn shirt, and no one cared. But Ruth stopped. She was supposed to be meeting a husband she'd never seen a future promised on paper. Instead, she found a stranger with blood on his hands and death in his eyes. When the sheriff told her to leave him, she whispered words that would change both their lives forever. "You're coming with me." What she didn't know then was that the man she dragged home wasn't just another drifter. He carried a name whispered in town papers. Caleb, heir to a fortune hunted by his own kin. A man the world believed already dead. And Ruth herself was no stranger to being abandoned. At 50 years old, she had endured rejection, silence, and the cruel weight of being called unwanted. She came west for a chance, not for glory, but fate handed her something far heavier, a man broken by betrayal and a choice that would test every ounce of strength left in her. Why would a woman with nothing risk everything for a stranger? Why would she choose compassion in a world that had shown her only cruelty? And what secret would Caleb reveal in the quiet of her cabin? Secrets of brothers who would kill to silence him. Secrets that might burn down everything she touched. This is not just a tale of survival. It is a story of a woman who refused to keep walking, of a rancher who learned that wealth means nothing without someone who sees your soul, and of how love, unexpected, late and tender, can bloom even in the coldest winters of life. But the question lingers. When the men hunting Caleb finally come to the cabin, will Ruth's choice to save him be the reason they both live, or the reason they both fall? The wind at Dry Creek Station cut like a blade, sharp enough to make even the strongest men bend their shoulders and hurry along. But Ruth Carver did not hurry. At 50, she had grown used to the weight of stairs, the whispers behind her back, the cruel laughter that came when people thought she couldn't hear. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the years had taught her one truth: dignity was the only thing no one could sell or steal. She stepped off the train, her valise heavy with the little she owned, threadbare clothes, a Bible with her mother's notes in the margins, and a small tin box of sewing needles. She had come west under a promise of marriage. A rancher widowed had written her letters, warm, kind words that almost made her believe life might give her one last chance. But no one came to meet her. The platform emptied quickly, boots clattering on frozen planks. The townspeople glanced at her, some with pity, others with something sharper. She kept her eyes on the snow drifting across the tracks. That's when she saw him. At first she thought it was a pile of rags left by a freight car. But the rags moved. A hand twitched. Blood stained the boards dark beneath him. His coat was torn, his face gaunt, eyes closed. She froze, heart hammering. Around them, men and women walked past as though he didn't exist. Ruth set down her valise. She lowered herself to her knees, ignoring the sting of cold wood. Her fingers trembled as she reached for his neck. A pulse. Faint but there. "Don't," a voice warned. The station master leaned against the door, chewing a toothpick. "Not your problem, lady. Some drifter got himself shot up. Best leave him." Ruth looked at him steadily. "He's still breathing." The man shrugged. "Won't be for long." Behind her, boots crunched. A sheriff's star caught the weak light. "You'd best stand," he told her. "We don't take kindly to strangers dragging trouble into town." Ruth pressed her palm against the stranger's wound, felt the warmth of blood seeping fast. She lifted her chin. "I've known trouble most of my life, Sheriff, but I've never walked past a soul still clinging to breath." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "You here for Cobb the rancher?" Her throat tightened. "No one came for me." "Then you're alone." He turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Ruth's breath fogged the air. She looked down at the man, unshaven, broken, yet something in the shape of his jaw spoke of strength that had not yet died. With a grunt, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag. Each step scraped fire through her back. People stared. Someone laughed. But she did not stop. The cart at the edge of the platform waited, half buried in snow. She heaved him onto it, her breath tearing from her lungs. "You're coming with me," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. No answer came. Only the hiss of snow against the tracks, the sound of a woman past her youth, choosing once more not to look away. The wind at Dry Creek Station cut like a blade, sharp enough to make even the strongest men bend their shoulders and hurry along. But Ruth Carver did not hurry. At 50, she had grown used to the weight of stares, the whispers behind her back, the cruel laughter that came when people thought she couldn't hear. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the years had taught her one truth: dignity was the only thing no one could sell or steal. She stepped off the train, her valise heavy with the little she owned, threadbare clothes, a Bible with her mother's notes in the margins, and a small tin box of sewing needles. She had come west under a promise of marriage. A rancher widowed had written her letters, warm, kind words that almost made her believe life might give her one last chance. But no one came to meet her. The platform emptied quickly, boots clattering on frozen planks. The townspeople glanced at her, some with pity, others with something sharper. She kept her eyes on the snow drifting across the tracks. That's when she saw him. At first she thought it was a pile of rags left by a freight car. But the rags moved. A hand twitched. Blood stained the boards dark beneath him. His coat was torn, his face gaunt, eyes closed. She froze, heart hammering. Around them, men and women walked past as though he didn't exist. Ruth set down her valise. She lowered herself to her knees, ignoring the sting of cold wood. Her fingers trembled as she reached for his neck. A pulse, faint but there. "Don't," a voice warned. The station master leaned against the door, chewing a toothpick. "Not your problem, lady. Some drifter got himself shot up. Best leave him." Ruth looked at him steadily. "He's still breathing." The man shrugged. "Won't be for long." Behind her, boots crunched. A sheriff's star caught the weak light. "You'd best stand," he told her. "We don't take kindly to strangers dragging trouble into town." Ruth pressed her palm against the stranger's wound, felt the warmth of blood seeping fast. She lifted her chin. "I've known trouble most of my life, Sheriff, but I've never walked past a soul still clinging to breath." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "You here for Cobb, the rancher?" Her throat tightened. "No one came for me." "Then you're alone." He turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Ruth's breath fogged the air. She looked down at the man, unshaven, broken, yet something in the shape of his jaw spoke of strength that had not yet died. With a grunt, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag. Each step scraped fire through her back. People stared. Someone laughed. But she did not stop. The cart at the edge of the platform waited, half buried in snow. She heaved him onto it, her breath tearing from her lungs. "You're coming with me," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. No answer came. Only the hiss of snow against the tracks, the sound of a woman past her youth, choosing once more not to look away. Ruth thought she had come west to marry a stranger. Instead, she had chosen to save one. And in that moment, she didn't yet know that the act of pulling him from the platform would pull her into a story larger than either of them. The cabin creaked under the weight of winter. Ruth had never called it home, only shelter, four walls left to her by a cousin she barely remembered, a roof patched more with faith than lumber. It was small, drafty, but it had a bed, and now the bed held a dying man. She had done what she could. Stripped his shirt, boiled water, stitched the wound with hands that shook but never faltered. Her body remembered 1,000 tasks from years of mending, though never flesh this torn. He'd grown once, eyes fluttering, then sunk back into darkness. Ruth sat through the night, feeding the fire with pine she had chopped herself. Her fingers burned from cold and blood, her heart heavy. She had saved him, perhaps only long enough to watch him die. Near dawn, a sound broke through, the rasp of breath, different from before. Stronger. She leaned close. His eyes flickered open, startling blue against the pallor of his face. They locked on hers, wild at first, then narrowing. "Who are you?" he whispered, voice like gravel. "No one important," Ruth said softly. "But I wasn't about to let you die on a train platform." He coughed, winced, clutched his side. "You should have left me." Her lips curved, not quite a smile. "Men have been leaving me all my life. I don't much care to return the favor." For a long time he only stared at her chest, rising shallow and quick. Then, as if the words cost more than the wound, he said, "Name's Caleb." The name sparked faint recognition. She had heard it once whispered over a poker table in town, a rancher's son who'd vanished after a land dispute, presumed dead, leaving behind both fortune and enemies. She did not speak it aloud. Instead, she ladled broth into a chipped cup, held it to his lips. He drank weakly, eyes never leaving hers. When he finished, he leaned back exhausted. "You took a risk," he murmured. I've lived on risk, Ruth answered. Her voice wavered, then steadied. It teaches a person where her strength lies. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of fire. Then faintly he said, I don't deserve this. Her throat tightened. Neither did I. All those years I begged for kindness and found none. But here we are. For the first time since dragging him from the platform, Ruth felt something shift inside her. A fragile thread pulling two strangers closer, not out of choice but survival. She turned toward the window. Snow drifted soft but endless, as if the world meant to bury them both. But Ruth Carver knew one truth: she had chosen this, and she would see it through. Ruth thought she had simply saved a man, but when his eyes opened and named himself, she realized she had invited danger and perhaps destiny into her fragile cabin. Days bled into one another, each marked by the soft hiss of boiling water and the crack of logs on fire. Caleb healed slowly, his body fighting fever and pain, his spirit restless. Ruth tended him as she would a wounded animal, gentle but cautious, aware he might lash out. Sometimes when he drifted into sleep, he called names that weren't hers. A woman's voice lingered in his throat, then a harsh growl of men words slurred with anger. Once he jolted awake, clutching her wrist so tight she gasped. His eyes were wild, unseeing, until he recognized her. Then he let go, shame flickering across his face. You should have left me where I was, he rasped one evening, staring into the fire. And yet, Ruth replied, setting a bowl of stew before him. You're still here. His jaw tightened. Do you know who I am? She hesitated. I know enough. Then you know I bring trouble. Her gaze held steady. I've lived with trouble longer than I've lived with peace. Doesn't scare me anymore. But her words weren't entirely true. At night, when the cabin grew quiet, Ruth lay awake, listening for footsteps outside, for the creak of a branch that wasn't wind. She remembered the sheriff's warning. You'll regret this. And part of her feared he was right. Yet another part, quieter, deeper, felt something different. In the stillness of the cabin, in the way Caleb looked at her, like he couldn't decide if she was real, Ruth felt alive in a way she hadn't in decades. Not safe, not comfortable, but alive. Still, fear gnawed at her. What if helping him cost her the fragile life she had rebuilt? What if, after all, she'd survived this act of kindness undid her? One night, as snow pressed heavy against the window, Caleb whispered into the dark, They'll come for me. Ruth's heart pounded. Who my brothers? Men who'd rather see me dead than lose what they think is theirs. Her throat closed. She thought of all the years she'd been discarded by men who saw women as property, burden, or amusement. And here was another storm walking straight into her life. She turned to him, her voice trembling, yet firm. Then they'll have to go through me first. Caleb's eyes widened as though no one had ever spoken those words for him before. For a moment he seemed less like a hunted man and more like a boy who had longed to be chosen. And Ruth realized with a pang that perhaps they were both learning how to be chosen for the first time. She thought the danger lived outside her cabin walls, but the real battle had already begun inside their hearts, where fear and longing wrestled for control. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of firelight and silence. Ruth had lived in solitude for so long that tending to another soul felt both foreign and strangely familiar, like slipping into an old song she hadn't sung in decades. Yet this was no gentle melody. Caleb carried storms inside him, storms that sometimes bled into her small cabin. At first he lay mostly unconscious, breathing shallow, his body fighting fever. Ruth sponged his forehead, boiled roots into bitter tea, and whispered prayers she wasn't sure she believed anymore. Her hands were steady, though her heart trembled. She had nursed dying animals before, even strangers who staggered in from blizzards, but this man, this stranger with a wound and a shadowed name, was different. When he dreamed, he muttered fragments, women's names, curses, spat between clenched teeth numbers like they were debts, not memories. Once in the dead of night, he seized her wrist with a grip so fierce she nearly screamed. His eyes flew open, blue wild, not seeing her. She froze, whispering softly until his focus returned. Then slowly his hand unclenched, shame flashing across his pale face. You should have left me there, he muttered hoarsely. Would have been easier. And yet you're still breathing, Ruth replied, pouring hot water over a cracked cloth. I don't leave folks to die. His gaze darkened. "Do you even know who I am?" Ruth studied him, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the rough beard, the way he looked half feral and half broken. "No," she admitted. "And it doesn't matter." But in truth, it did matter. She had seen the sheriff's eyes back at the station. "You'll regret this," he'd said. Those words haunted her. Caleb pressed on. "If you knew you'd send me back into the snow, I bring trouble." Ruth folded her arms. "I've lived with trouble longer than I've lived with peace. Doesn't scare me anymore." Her words were strong, but when she crawled into her bedroll at night, she stared at the ceiling, listening for sounds that didn't belong, a creak, a step, the snap of a twig beneath boots. Fear wrapped around her ribs. Not fear for herself. Ruth had long ago made peace with loneliness and pain, but fear that maybe, just maybe, letting this man live would cost her everything she'd built out of scraps. And yet, something else stirred within her. There were moments when Caleb's eyes softened, when he looked at her, not as a savior or a nurse, but as though he was trying to decide if she was real. In those brief flickers, Ruth felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years: alive. Not safe, not comfortable alive. But the tug of fear remained. One evening, snow pressed hard against the window, the fire hissing low. Caleb, sitting upright for the first time in days, broke the silence. "They'll come for me." Ruth paused, her hands stilling over a pan of broth. "Who, my brothers?" His voice cracked like a split log. "Men who'd rather see me buried than lose what they believe belongs to them." Her throat tightened. Brothers, family, turning on family for greed. It struck too close. Ruth remembered her own kin, a father who'd bartered her, like livestock, brothers who'd sneered when she couldn't produce sons, whispers of useless and burden trailing after her, like dust. And now, once again, a man sat in her cabin with the echo of betrayal staining his blood. "What do they want from you?" she asked quietly. "Land. A ranch that was never theirs. A fortune my father built with fists and sweat." He looked away. "They'd kill me to sign it all away." Ruth set down the ladle. Her voice shook, but her resolve did not. "Then they'll have to go through me first." Caleb turned, stunned. It wasn't bravado she spoke, it was truth, worn and weathered like the rest of her. He whispered, almost to himself, "No one's ever said that for me before." For a moment, Caleb looked less like a hunted man and more like a boy who had never been chosen. And Ruth realized with a pang they were both learning what it meant to be chosen, maybe for the first time. But the tension in the cabin grew thicker by the day. At night, Caleb woke screaming, drenched in sweat. Ruth held him down, whispering comfort she wished someone had once whispered to her. "You're safe. It's just a dream." But he shook his head violently. "Not a dream. A memory. They'll kill me." His voice cracked with something close to terror. Her heart ached. "Not while you're here." The next morning, Ruth found boot prints outside the cabin. They circled the barn, paused at the window, then led back to the trees. She stood there with the shotgun clutched in her hands, breath clouding in the cold. Inside, Caleb saw her pale face. "They know." She nodded. "I'm not running." "You should," he muttered. "No." Her voice was sharp. "I've been running my whole life. From my father. From men who thought they owned me. From a town that laughed when I was left at the altar." Her hands trembled, but she held the gun firm. "I'm done running." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he whispered, "I believe you." That night, sitting by the fire, Ruth took out an old scarf, threading it through her fingers. Caleb watched. "Do you miss anyone?" she asked softly. He swallowed hard. "My mother. She died when I was 16. My father said crying was weakness, so I didn't cry." Ruth's lips trembled. Mine said the same. Until the day he cried himself, when he realized he taught my brothers greed instead of kindness. Silence stretched heavy, yet strangely healing. Finally, Caleb whispered, "I never meant to live. Not after I left everything behind." He turned to her. "But then you showed up." Ruth felt her chest tighten. She didn't know if he meant gratitude or something deeper, but his words rooted in her heart. And yet the fear remained. Fear of the men coming for him. Fear of losing the fragile piece of belonging she had just begun to feel. Fear of choosing hope only to see it ripped away again. She thought the danger lived outside her cabin walls, but the real battle had already begun inside their hearts, where fear and longing wrestled for control. The storm broke 3 nights later. It wasn't a storm of snow or wind, though the sky had turned black and the trees groaned under heavy drifts. It was the kind of storm Ruth had feared since she saw those footprints outside her cabin. A storm that walked on 2 legs carrying rifles and wearing hatred like armor. She heard the horses first, hooves crunching over frost. A murmur of voices carried on the cold. Caleb, still weak but mending, stiffened from his place near the fire. He had been restless all evening, pacing in jagged circles, his hand lingering near the shotgun Ruth kept loaded above the door. "They've found us," he whispered. Ruth's breath caught. She set down the kettle with steady hands, though her pulse raced like a frightened colt. She had always lived with danger men who mocked men, who sneered men, who thought women were nothing but coin to be traded. But this was different. These weren't strangers. These were his brothers coming to take what he wouldn't give. And she knew in her bones they would not leave without blood. The first knock on the cabin door wasn't gentle. It rattled, the wood splinters shaking loose. "Mercer," a voice bellowed. Harsh, cruel. "Come out and face your kin. Don't make us burn this shack to the ground." Caleb's jaw clenched. His face, pale from fever, hardened like stone. "It's them," he said. Ruth stepped closer, her hand brushing the shotgun. "Then let's give them an answer." Caleb looked at her, startled. "You don't have to." She cut him off. "I told you. I'm done running." For a heartbeat, silence lay between them, heavy as the snow outside. Then Caleb nodded, the faintest ghost of respect in his tired eyes. The door shook again under another pounding fist. Ruth raised her voice, calm but sharp. "This is my home. If you think you can take him, you'll have to take me first." Laughter spilled from outside, cold, mocking. A woman's threats. "You've gone soft, brother." Hiding behind some withered spinster, Caleb's eyes burned, but Ruth's stayed steady. The insult was nothing new. She had carried words like spinster and burden for decades, each one a stone added to the load she bore. Tonight she set the stones down. She leveled the shotgun. "Try me." The cabin window shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor as a bullet slammed into the mantel. Ruth flinched but didn't drop the gun. Caleb dragged her to the ground, his own body shielding hers, though he grimaced in pain. "You'll get killed," he hissed. "Not if I stand with you," she whispered. Outside, boots crunched closer. Shadows moved against the snow. 4, maybe 5 men. Caleb cursed under his breath. "They want the deed, the ranch, the railroad. They'll kill us both for it." Ruth's voice cracked but did not falter. "Then we fight not for paper, for life, for the right to choose our own." Caleb stared at her, something breaking open in his chest. He had spent years believing no one would stand beside him without a price. Yet here she was, a woman mocked and discarded, choosing to stay even when the cost could be her blood. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered. His eyes gleamed under the brim of a hat. "Brother," he drawled. Caleb stiffened. "Thomas," the man smirked, "didn't think you'd crawl far bleeding in the snow. But here you are, hiding with... What is she? A mail-order bride, too desperate to know better." Ruth didn't flinch. She stepped forward, shotgun aimed square at his chest. "She's the reason he's still alive," she said flatly. Thomas laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Then she'll die first." The words hung in the air like frost. Caleb surged to his feet, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "Touch her, and you'll never leave this place breathing." For a moment, the two brothers stared at one another, one carved by greed, the other by exile, one willing to kill, the other willing to bleed. And Ruth stood between them, her hands steady, her voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut the night. "This ends tonight, not with your papers, not with your land, but with whether you can walk away knowing you lost." The standoff broke in chaos. Another shot rang out from the trees. Caleb shoved Ruth aside as the bullet tore into the doorframe. He winced, grabbing the rifle from the wall. Ruth fired once, the blast shaking her arms, scattering snow outside as the men ducked. Screams, curses, horses whinnied in panic. "Fall back," one voice barked, but Thomas stayed. He lifted his pistol, aimed straight at Ruth. For one frozen second, time stretched. She saw the gleam of the barrel, the fury in his eyes. And then Caleb stepped in front of her. The shot cracked like thunder. Caleb staggered, clutching his shoulder. Blood bloomed against his shirt. "No," Ruth cried, catching him before he fell. Thomas sneered, but his smirk faltered as Ruth leveled her shotgun again. Her hands shook with rage, but her aim was true. "Leave," she said, her voice low, trembling with power. "Or I swear by God I'll bury you myself." For the first time, Thomas hesitated. He saw something in her eyes, something that would not break, something he could not own. With a curse, he backed toward the door. "This isn't over." "No," Ruth whispered, cradling Caleb's bleeding form. "It's just beginning." When the night finally fell silent, Ruth pressed cloth against Caleb's wound, tears streaking down her face. "You fool," she whispered. "Why would you take a bullet for me?" His lips curved weakly. "Because you were the only one who said I could come with you." Her chest broke open at his words. For the first time in years, Ruth let herself weep, not from weakness, but from the weight of being seen. She had dragged him from death once, but now Ruth wondered if love itself could keep a man alive when the world was determined to steal him back. The night after Thomas rode away was long and ragged. Ruth barely slept. She sat at the edge of the bed, pressing torn strips of cloth against Caleb's shoulder. Every time he stirred in pain, every time his breath hitched, her heart clenched like a fist. Snow fell heavy outside, muffling the world in silence. Inside the cabin was thick with smoke and fear. She had thought herself hardened by years of rejection, by the men who mocked her body, by the family who said she was too old for love, by neighbors who whispered that a woman past 50 had no place dreaming of a new life. But now, staring at Caleb's pale face, Ruth realized something had shifted. For the first time in decades, she was terrified of losing, not her pride, not her place, but someone who mattered. When dawn crept over the ridge, Caleb's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her as if he'd fought through fire just to see her face. "You're still here," he rasped. Ruth's throat tightened. "Of course I'm here." "You should have run," he whispered. Her voice cracked, but the words came sharp. "I've been running my whole life, from shame, from loneliness, from men who thought they owned me. I won't run again, not from you." Caleb's lips curved, faint, but true. "Then I'm already saved." Ruth shook her head, fighting tears. "Not yet, but you will be." That morning she made a decision. She boiled herbs her mother once taught her to use for fever-pressed salves into Caleb's wound, changed the bandages with hands steadier than she felt. And when she stepped outside to fetch water, she didn't just glance nervously at the tree line. She stared at it, jaw set, daring it to stare back. Thomas would return. She knew it. He wanted the deed, the land, the railroad, everything Caleb refused to sign away. But Ruth understood, now this fight was more than land. It was about dignity, about saying no when the world demanded your surrender. For years she had been silent when men treated her like a burden, but not anymore. By the third day, Caleb was stronger. He could sit up, sip broth, even joke with her in that dry, stubborn way of his. "You look fiercer with a shotgun than any lawman I ever saw," he murmured, watching her clean the weapon. Ruth arched an eyebrow. "Don't think flattery will earn you more soup." He smiled, soft, crooked, real. "It's not flattery if it's true." She blushed but didn't look away. Something inside her was thawing like ice breaking under spring sun. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth told him something she had never spoken aloud. "My father once promised me to a man twice my age, said it was my only chance. When I refused, he called me worthless, said no one would ever want me. For years I believed him." Caleb's eyes softened. "He was wrong." Ruth swallowed hard. "And when I finally did marry, he left me for a younger woman. Took our savings too. The town called me a fool for trusting him. I carried that shame so long it became part of me." Caleb reached across the table, his hand trembling, but strong enough to cover hers. "Then let it go. Tonight. Here. With me. You are not what they said. You are the reason I'm alive." The words hit her like light through storm clouds. For the first time, Ruth felt the weight begin to lift. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like stones set down after a lifetime of caring. 2 nights later, the storm broke again. Not with bullets, but with voices outside the cabin. Ruth heard the crunch of snow, the low murmur of men. She grabbed the shotgun, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Caleb pushed himself upright despite the pain. "They won't stop," he said grimly. "Then neither will we," Ruth replied. Through the frosted window, she saw lanterns flicker among the trees. 5 men this time. More than before. Thomas was bringing force. Ruth tightened her grip on the gun. We can't outshoot them all. Caleb's gaze locked on hers. Then we outlast them. He explained quickly a path through the woods, an old hunting shack where they could hide until dawn. Ruth hesitated. She had never fled from danger before, not like this, but she saw the determination in his eyes. This wasn't running. This was surviving. Together they slipped into the snow. Caleb leaned heavily on her, but his steps were firm. Ruth guided him through the trees, her breath clouding the night. Behind them, voices shouted, lanterns swaying. They reached the shack just as moonlight broke through the clouds. It was small, broken down, half buried in snow, but it was shelter. Inside, Ruth lit a small fire, her hands trembling from cold. Caleb sank onto a bench, his face drawn but alive. For a moment, silence wrapped them like a blanket. Then Ruth whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. Caleb looked at her, his blue eyes shining in the firelight. Why not? Because fear kept me small, kept me quiet, and now standing with you, I know I'm more than what they said I was. Caleb's lips curved into a smile, soft and aching. You always were. When dawn came, Thomas and his men had vanished. They had searched, no doubt, but the storm had covered Ruth and Caleb's tracks. For now they were safe. Ruth stepped outside, watching the sun rise over the snowy ridge. She felt taller somehow, like the years of shame had melted into the snow beneath her boots. Inside, Caleb called her name, his voice rough but steady. She turned back, warmth blooming in her chest. For once, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And for the first time in her long, battered life, she was free. The fight wasn't over. Thomas would return, stronger, hungrier. But Ruth had discovered something more powerful than fear, the will to stand, to love, to choose her own fate. The days that followed the storm were quiet in ways Ruth had almost forgotten the world could be. Snow melted slowly, dripping from the cabin roof into soft rivulets that whispered against the earth. The hunting shack had been abandoned for years, but Ruth cleaned it, with careful hands sweeping out dust, patching a broken window, with cloth making the place something that felt less like hiding and more like beginning. Caleb healed by inches. His fever broke. The angry red around his wounds softened into pink. Every morning Ruth helped him dress, steadying his arm when the pain caught him. At first he resisted, muttering that a man should walk on his own. But Ruth only smiled gently, her voice like warm water smoothing stone. You carried your burden alone too long. Let someone share it now. He didn't argue after that. One evening, as the fire burned low, Ruth pulled out a piece of cloth from her trunk, a faded square, quilted long ago by her mother. It had traveled with her through every rejection, every lonely night, and she had always thought of it as a reminder of what she had lost. But now as she draped it across Caleb's shoulders, it felt different. Like it was meant for this moment, for this man who had nearly bled his life out on a cold train platform. Caleb touched the fabric, rough fingers lingering on the worn stitching. You've carried this a long time, Ruth nodded. It's the only thing I never let go of. He looked at her, then not at her age, not at her size, not at the years etched into her skin, but at the woman who had stayed when no one else did. I think he said softly, you carried more than a quilt all these years. You carried yourself with dignity when others couldn't see it. Her breath caught. No man had ever spoken of her like that. The quiet days gave them room to speak, and silence gave them courage to confess. Caleb told her of his brothers, of how they schemed to carve his father's empire into something soulless and cruel, of how he had refused to sign away the ranch, and for that refusal they had branded him a traitor, left him to die. Ruth listened, her heart aching not only for his wounds but for the boy he once was, the boy who had believed family meant loyalty. And when he faltered, she told him her story in return of being bartered like livestock to a man she never loved, of escaping only to be abandoned by another, of nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if life had already passed her by. She expected pity. Instead, Caleb only took her hand. They were fools, he whispered, every one of them. To look at you and not see the treasure they were given. Her eyes shimmered. And what do you see? Caleb's lips curved in the smallest, gentlest smile. Home. By the second week, he was strong enough to walk to the stream. Ruth went with him, her arm steady under his. They sat together on a fallen log, the sound of water rushing beneath ice filling the silence. For years, Ruth had avoided mirrors, avoided her reflection in shop windows. But now with Caleb beside her, she felt no shame. The lines in her face told stories. The weight she carried was not something to mock, it was proof she had survived. Do you know, she said softly, watching the water break around the stones, I used to think love was for the young. That once you passed a certain age, you were invisible. Caleb tilted his head, studying her. Invisible to fools, maybe, but not to me. I see you clearer than I've ever seen anyone. Ruth's throat tightened. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that spring might come for her too. That night, Caleb woke from a nightmare, shouting his brother's name, clawing at the blankets. Ruth rushed to him, held his face in her palms, whispered until his breathing slowed. When his eyes finally opened wet and wild, he looked at her as though ashamed. You shouldn't have to carry my ghosts. Ruth shook her head. We all carry ghosts. Yours don't frighten me. Why? Because I've lived with my own for too long to run from another's. And because she paused, her voice barely a whisper, when I look at you, I don't see ghosts. I see a man who still has a future. Caleb stared at her then, as if her words stitched something inside him no doctor could reach. Spring sunlight finally broke through the trees one morning, golden and bright. Ruth stood outside, breathing it in, when Caleb stepped up behind her. His arm was still weak, but his hand found hers easily. You saved me, he said quietly. Ruth shook her head. We saved each other. He turned her hand over, pressed it to his chest. Then let's keep saving each other for however many days we have left. Her heart swelled, not with the desperate ache of youth, but with something deeper, steadier, something that had waited 50 years to bloom. The world outside was still dangerous. Caleb's brothers still held power, and Thomas was not finished. But inside that cabin, Ruth had found something she thought was lost forever, hope, warm, fragile, and shining. The thaw of spring did not bring peace. Tracks appeared near the cabin one morning, boot prints pressed into the mud circling the barn before disappearing into the trees. Caleb saw them first, his jaw tightening, his eyes hard. They found us, he muttered. Ruth stood beside him, her hands folded over her apron. For a moment, fear threatened to rise in her chest, sharp and familiar. But when she looked at Caleb, when she remembered the night she had dragged him out of the snow, with nothing but stubborn faith, she found her courage waiting. Then let them come, she said quietly. We're not running. That night, the woods whispered with movement. Shadows shifted between the trees. Caleb sat at the table, a rifle laid across his lap. But Ruth stood at the window with the shotgun. She had only fired it once before, years ago, but her hands were steady now. They think you're weak, she said to him. Caleb glanced up, the faintest smile tugging his lips. Then they've never met you. Her heart stirred at that. For the first time, she didn't feel like someone's burden, someone's afterthought. She felt like a partner, chosen, trusted, necessary. The attack came at dawn. 2 men on horseback thundered from the tree line, shouting Caleb's name. A third crouched low in the shadows, his rifle gleaming in the light. Ruth fired first, not to kill, but to scatter the horses. The thunder of hooves broke their line, sent one rider sprawling. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his stance firm, despite the lingering weakness in his shoulder. Thomas, he shouted, his voice cut through the gunfire like a bell. A figure stepped forward, older, sharper, with eyes like winter steel. Thomas Mercer. You should have died in that freight car, Thomas called. You think one broken woman can save you? Ruth's breath hitched, but Caleb only stepped closer, his voice steady. She already did. The standoff stretched thin like the pause before a storm breaks. Then Thomas raised his pistol. Ruth lifted hers. Caleb's hand touched her arm. No, he said. Not with hate. The word startled her. For years she had lived believing survival required hardness. Yet here was a man battered and betrayed who still believed there was another way. Thomas fired first. Caleb moved faster than Ruth thought possible. The bullet grazed his side, tearing fabric but not flesh. Caleb's rifle barked, once shattering Thomas's pistol clean from his hand. The woods fell silent. Thomas staggered back, stunned. Ruth lowered her gun but kept her eyes fixed on him. Leave, Caleb said, voice rough but certain. There's nothing for you here but shame. Thomas's mouth twisted, but he saw it in Caleb's stance, in Ruth's unflinching gaze. He saw that this battle was already lost. With a snarl, he turned, disappearing into the trees. When it was over, Ruth sank to the porch, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Caleb lowered himself beside her, his breath ragged. "You should have let me finish it," she whispered. He shook his head. "I've lived too long in shadows. I don't want our lives to begin with blood." Her chest tightened and tears spilled, quiet but unstoppable. "You talk like we have lives left to live." Caleb turned to her, then his hand cupping her cheek, rough and tender. "We do, if you'll share them with me." Ruth pressed her forehead to his, the morning sun spilling gold over the cabin. She felt the warmth seep into her bones, into the cracks of all the years she thought she had wasted. The days that followed were gentler. They repaired the barn together, Ruth steady on the ladder, while Caleb held the planks in place. They planted seeds in the small patch of earth behind the cabin. At night they sat by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, always content. Ruth began to sing again, low and steady as she worked. Caleb listened, his eyes closing, as though the sound itself was medicine. "You sing like someone who still believes," he told her once. Ruth smiled faintly. "I'm learning to." Weeks later, a letter arrived from town. A clerk had uncovered Thomas's fraud, exposed the forged papers. Caleb's name was cleared. His inheritance, land, cattle, and railroad shares was his to claim. Ruth read the letter aloud, her voice even. Then she folded it and set it aside. "What will you do?" she asked. Caleb was quiet a long time, staring into the fire. Then he took her hand. "I'll take back what's mine, but not for myself. For us. For everyone they tried to ruin." Ruth searched his face, and for the first time she saw not just the wounded man she had carried from the snow, but the leader he was always meant to be. The spring stretched into summer. Caleb returned to town not as a broken drifter, but as a man who had survived and chosen life. Ruth walked beside him, plain blue dress, brushing the dust, her hair braided with a simple ribbon. The whispers started at once. Some scoffed, too old, too heavy, too plain. But Caleb only took her hand in front of them all. "This is my wife," he said, his voice ringing clear. The words silenced every doubt. For Ruth, it was not the wealth, not the land, not even the vindication. It was the look in his eyes when he said it, steady, certain, proud. That night back at the cabin, Ruth sat on the porch swing Caleb had built. The sky blazed violet and gold. Caleb joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "I never thanked you," he said softly. "You don't need to." "I do. You didn't just save my life. You gave me back my soul." Ruth's eyes shimmered as she whispered, "And you gave me a reason to believe love isn't just for the young." They sat there as the stars blinked awake, two souls who had waited half a lifetime to find one another. And in the hush of that wide western sky, their story settled not as an ending, but as a beginning. Ruth had once been mocked as unworthy, forgotten by time. Caleb had once been left to die by his own kin. But together they discovered what the world could not give, and what time could not take, a love born late, but true, deep, and everlasting. In the end, Ruth did not find the husband she had been promised. She found something rarer, a man who needed her courage more than her hand, and who gave her back a truth she had nearly forgotten, that even the most wounded hearts still deserve a place to rest. Caleb was not saved by wealth or by the power of his family name. He was saved by the simple act of a woman who refused to walk past. In that quiet cabin among firelight and snow, two people scarred by life discovered that love is not about youth or perfection. It is about presence, compassion, and the steady choice to stay. And isn't that something we all long for? A reminder that we are never too old, too tired, or too broken to be chosen. That sometimes the smallest act of kindness can rewrite the ending we thought was already set. So as you turn off this story tonight, I invite you to carry this truth with you. The world is full of people walking past. But maybe, just maybe, you can be the one who stops. Thank you for sharing this journey with us here on None, Wild West Saga. If Ruth and Caleb's story touched your heart, please subscribe, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us, would you like to see more stories like this, or perhaps a continuation of theirs? Your voice guides where we go next.